Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to our PaTHways Careers event for this term. We're back on Zoom, but it's because we have an international panel and we're going to be talking about working overseas. And we've got attendees who've registered through from matriculation years 1972 through to current freshers of 22 and from 12 different countries. So Belgium, France, Germany, Indonesia, Malaysia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and USA and UK. So we've got a panel of 4 alumni. We've got Phil Ewels from 2008, who read biological sciences and in Stockholm. Christine Manson from 2005, who read geography and is now in Bali. Paul Murphy from 2002, who read history and is now in Spain, and Freddie Parker from 2008, who read modern and medieval languages and is now in New York. So they'll be talking much more later, but chairing the session for us is Professor Jennifer Howard-Grenville, who's the Diageo Professor of Organisation Studies at the Judge Business School and also a fellow at Trinity Hall. So I'm going to hand over to Jen to lead the questions, but of course, if you do want to ask any questions at any point, we encourage you to use the Q&A function on Zoom. So I'll hand over to you, Jen.
Thank you so much, Shell, and welcome everyone. It's delightful to have all of our panelists here from many parts around the globe and to have so many of you attending. We have limited time, so I'm going to jump straight into exploring the career pathways of our fascinating panelists and what has taken them both through their careers and to other countries around the world. So the first question, and I'm going to start with you, Paul, is asking each of you to share a little bit about your pathway to working overseas. Did you always plan to do so, or did it come around through just some serendipitous opportunities? Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I think 2 serendipitous opportunities, really. The first one being that I married a woman who had very strong links to Spain, and therefore her family live out here. Though it was never our intention to move out to Spain. Then I think being locked up for the best part of 2 years during COVID as a teacher was incredibly frustrating. So I decided to look at international opportunities, and having the Spanish language somewhat already, decided that Spain was the place we wanted to look at. Correspondingly, I'd also spent a lot of time in the UK working in rather large educational establishments, and so I was quite intrigued by the international market and felt that slotting into a big group like the Inspired Group, which has about 80 schools internationally, was one whereby I could both maintain my links back with the UK, be part of a big global system, whilst enjoying the cultural delights that Madrid has to offer. So I'd say partially personal and partially professional, all in one, and I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. A nice example of how COVID and what it all forced us to do has brought new opportunities. Could we turn to you, Phil, next on the same question, your pathway, surprise or plan?
Yeah, a fairly comparable answer really to Paul. So I work in research and science, and I did a PhD and a postdoc in Cambridge, and I knew that I wanted to move abroad to do the next stage of my career. That was always kind of part of the plan. It's pretty common for those of us working in kind of academia to move around. And I think it's really beneficial to work with different groups and see how different people work, and also avoid, as most people in the audience, I guess, I've always loved traveling and always wanted to live in a different culture and get fully immersed somewhere else. So when I finished my postdoc in Cambridge, I was really keen to move somewhere else. So I quite liked the lifestyle in the Nordics, and was also thinking about Canada and New Zealand, and had all of these ideas swirling around in my head. And then I got a girlfriend who's half Swedish and is living in Sweden, and that made up my mind for me. And she's now my wife. And 8.5 years later, I'm still in Sweden, which I would never have predicted. She's half Swedish, so we met in the UK. When we moved here, I don't think we planned to stay in Sweden forever, but we're now quite settled and really like it here.
Great, good. I'm seeing a commonality, and also you were both in the field of education writ large, which actually happens everywhere, and so that does mean that when one takes the opportunity to be quite mobile, that's a great thing to do. I'm going to turn to you now, Christine, because I suppose with an MPhil in geography, we might expect that you would end up in Bali, but how did you get there?
It's a great question. So in contrast to my predecessors, my path was very, very intentional. I have 2 degrees in geography. And I think from the time I was an undergraduate, I was looking for an excuse to travel. I knew I wanted to travel, and I knew I liked people. And so finding a career that meshed those together really ended up being international business. But then through my MPhil at Cambridge, studied more epidemiology and human geography, but dealing with medicine and the spread of disease. And so it's taken me, I guess over the last 20 years, I've probably lived and worked in about 25 countries. Bali was accidental, but I think as we'll start to discover through some of the other questions during our time together today, entrepreneurship does that to you. You, especially being an accidental entrepreneur, you find an opportunity in a place and you stand there, you stay there.
That's fantastic. So that's partly intentional, but then partly just as things evolve, it takes you to new places and new opportunities. Great. And last but not least, Freddie, you're in New York doing investment banking, and those two things probably go together, but you could have stayed in the UK. So tell us a little bit about what happened with you.
Yeah, they do pretty naturally go together. This is actually, funnily enough, my sort of second stint of working abroad. My first was still whilst I was at Cambridge, so I did MML and studied Spanish and Russian, and as part of that had a year abroad where I actually worked for HSBC in Argentina. So I'd done the working for a bank abroad thing, albeit under, I guess, very different circumstances earlier in life. I think my sort of path here is probably pretty unremarkable for the industry, insofar as you say, New York is really the sort of global epicenter of the sort of investment banking industry, and particularly the bit of it that I touch, which is largely focused on hedge funds. So the bulk of our client base as a firm globally sits in and around the New York area. So it made a lot of sense for me to be here, I guess, on a longer term basis. But it wasn't part of an explicit plan on my part. It was more a case of I think I sort of indicated that I was open to the idea of moving at some point in time. And then, funnily enough, I was offered two jobs, but both I was working for Goldman Sachs in London, and both those jobs were in Goldman, but in different offices. So I was offered a job in Hong Kong and simultaneously a job in New York. And of the two, New York felt like the easier one to say yes to. And then for my part, on the sort of the personal side of things, it happened the other way around, insofar as I had an English girlfriend in London who, through the sort of vagaries of the US immigration process, became a wife and now lives with me here in New York.
Excellent. So it's fascinating to hear about how these things happen. And, sometimes there's a bit of plan and then there's a lot of just serendipity in how things evolve. And it's your work, not just your lives that have taken you or kept you in certain places. So the second question I have for each of you is, what's the biggest unexpected lesson that you take from having worked abroad? And how did that lesson affect your career trajectory or your life? And I'm not going to pick someone to speak. I'm going to let you self-nominate if you'd like to kick us off. Who wants to go first? Well, I will pick then. Paul wants to go first. Go ahead, Paul.
I think I've just signed a lot of lessons where no one puts their hand up and feel the awkwardness of being at the front where no one responds is a terrible place to be. Just very quickly on education, one of the most fascinating differences, the way in which parenting is politicized in a totally different way in Spain and indeed in Italy, where I've done a little bit of work as well, to in the UK, and where certainly when you start getting to the nitty-gritty of how you design an educational curriculum, you have to be very careful in Spain, for example, when you talk about the Francoist era, or when you attempt to suggest that British values are the way that everything should be done, as international schools are legally obliged to do in order for us to pass our inspections. And so I expected a bit of that. But one actually finds that people are much more forthright here in Madrid about whether we have incorrectly or correctly politicized their children from as young as 2 or 3 years old because of the way we choose to teach how democracy ought to function, or things like that, which probably does have a knock-on effect. Some of the rest of you in the institutions in which you work, where the cultural differences certainly mean that what is considered very normal back in the UK, for example, are general policies on how we are allowed to or not allowed to promote LGBTQ plus rights. differ immensely. So I don't know how everyone else has found that kind of thing in terms of fitting into other cultures, but certainly politicization, even of individuals as young as 2 and 3, is something that's conceived of as possible here in Spain, whereas in the UK, I don't think anyone would bat any eyelids too much with what we were doing. And I'll stop there.
Fascinating, Paul. I mean, you know, obviously cultural difference is a big issue, but it goes beyond how do you buy something at the shops. In your case, very deeply to what you're actually doing in your professional life. Brief follow-up, is there a way that you've had to adapt in terms of your work on that?
I mean, in terms of adaptation, I think personally, I did see a little bit of it coming, but the way in which we are expected to train individuals as we're sort of onboarding them into the Spanish system is significantly different from the way we would do it in the UK. So I've certainly adapted the extent to which I seek to, before employing someone, for example, walk them through the cultural differences and different expectations here, so that they're not walking into an environment where they might feel less comfortable working than they would realize in advance. I used the example earlier of the LGBTQ+ community, where our hands are tied a lot more in Madrid than they are back in the UK. That would be another good example of where I want people to be aware of what the situations often end up in here educationally before they say yes to a job, for example.
Yeah, no, that's great, being able to share those experiences with others. Phil.
Yeah, I was going to say something quite similar, but on quite a broad level, which was I've been traveling to the Nordics and to Sweden quite a bit before I moved here, and I think Sweden is generally quite aligned with the UK in politics and in kind of philosophy, and so I didn't expect there to be very many changes in kind of my interactions with people when I moved here. But something that I think is really important to know for the people who haven't lived and worked abroad is that a lot of things only really start to reveal themselves once you actually embed yourself within a new society, and all the little things start to bubble up to the surface. And that's something I find fascinating, down to trivial things like in the UK, I would write an email and I'd start it with an introduction, a bit of small talk, and get to my point about, 2/3 of the way down the page. If you write an email like that in Sweden, no one will read it. It needs to be 2 sentences long with bullet points, get right to the point. And there's just so many little kind of micro changes like that, which are really interesting to live and work with.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And it's the micro changes that we don't necessarily expect going in. You might not guess it from my accent, but I was born in the UK, but raised in Canada and the US. You'd probably guess the latter from my accent. And I'm amazed since moving back here to Cambridge, it really does take time to see these subtle differences between countries that actually are broadly incredibly similar. Over to Christine, if we can, because you've just, the sheer number of places that you've lived and experiences you've had, what's unexpected and surprising for you, or what has been a big lesson?
I think the gentleman before me alluded to a lot of what I was going to say, and it kind of alludes also to your next question, Jen, just about what opportunities present themselves when you live abroad. And I think to their point, you don't always know what exists until you get there. I have lived in countries where I took a job with a company, but now I run my own company. And that was an opportunity that I saw in a market that was untapped. And it was an exceptional opportunity, and it turned out to be a business that worked. And I think having had the experience that I had working in Latin America, in the West, in the United States, in the UK, and then bringing that experience and knowledge to a place like Asia has been huge, because I saw something that someone else didn't see. I saw an opportunity, and I've been able to scale that opportunity in a way that someone here could not have done, because I have that experience. It sounds bad, but sometimes I think too, when you're an outsider, you get this pass, right? People give you a pass if you don't know something, or you do something wrong, or you're willing to try something new or a new challenge, or you're kind of like seen as the silly outsider who's doing something crazy. But then if you could make it work, it's almost kind of like, oh, okay, well, maybe we could have done that, but this person got the pass, they got to do it, right? And so you get that kind of that little bit of extra I guess, green light, if you will, as an outsider living in a new place when it comes to things like entrepreneurship and opportunity.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Christine. And Peter's posted something in the Q&A sort of affirming the same idea, which is experience in multiple countries not only opens your eyes to this novelty in a way that actually enables you to see opportunities and, you know, maybe introduce them in a way that you can piece together your own experience, but also you're, quote, forgiven. You know, you maybe don't have to ask permission. We know that when we're embedded in a culture, we don't even see it and know it. We don't even see its constraints in some way and its opportunities. But when we're new to a country, we can see things anew, which sounds like what's been huge. And your area of work is, if I'm correct, water sanitation. Can you say a little bit more about how that entrepreneurial idea came about as a result of your international experience?
Absolutely. Actually, I run a ceramic water filter company. So it's a social enterprise, but it's also a homeschool business. It's a social enterprise in the respect that these water filters serve underprivileged families who don't have access to safe water. And we're focused on sustainable development goal number 6, which is water sanitation and hygiene. That said, I have taken this filter technology and flipped it on its head. And I've made a high-end version of this that I sell in the retail market for a lot of money, reinvest my profits to run the social aspect of the business. And so this had been done. The technology was invented in Guatemala. I just so happened to live there for many years and know the company that invented the technology. So I was able to study that company and build in some of the world's best practices on this technology and on my business in a brand new market.
Great. And the idea of delivering it in that way through a social enterprise and using, beneficiaries and sort of other customers to make it all work. Thank you. Over to you, Freddie. What was an unexpected experience from working overseas, and how did you take that forward in your career?
I mean, I think I'd echo much of what's already been said. I think particularly when you move from one, and maybe to your experience as well, Jennifer, when you move from one English-speaking country to another, I think you probably have a tendency to underestimate the differences. Especially moving from London to New York, you're going from one big global capital city to I guess New York's not the capital of the US, but sort of in many ways it is. It sort of feels like everything should be a very straightforward sort of plug and play from one to the next, and of course it isn't in many ways. And some of those things become immediately apparent in all of the sort of finicky details of, how do you find somewhere to live? How do you, get yourself kind of set up with all of the basic things you need for your day-to-day life, all the way through to, I guess, these kind of cultural undercurrents, which are a little bit harder to discern at first. And then beyond that, I think the other lesson has been the sort of sheer unpredictability of the whole thing. Insofar as when I took the offer to move here, in my mind, while I was kind of moving on an open-ended basis, it wasn't a sort of term limited contract to be here. I sort of budgeted that I would do this for 2 or 3 years and move back to London. It would kind of be a nice, interesting interlude in my career, but not my sort of final destination. Here I am 3.5 odd years in the middle of the US green card process and likely to be here for the foreseeable future. So I think part of the lesson is just kind of being willing to get an outcome, I think, that's quite different than the one that you maybe budgeted for in the first place.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think our next question is really, what do you foresee next in your own careers? Do you foresee future moves? It seems like, this message of some of you expected to be in a place more temporarily and are now settled, might preclude that. But I guess the broader question is, what do you really see as the value that comes from putting yourself into a new situation, whether it be a new region of the world, a new country, or even just a new sector or a switch in jobs? I think we've managed to follow a fairly stringent order here, but I'm open for anyone who wants to jump in, because you may not all have something to expand on this with. Is that your hand, Phil?
No, I was just meaning, but I can. My response is quite quick because it's an easy one, which is that we are personally fairly settled here. I've got a family with 3 small children, so this means I can't see us moving anytime in the near future, but I'd never say never. The only thing that's really changed for me in a big way is that I work remotely for a company, and our company is maybe 60 or 70. It's a fairly small startup company. We're about 40 people, but I think 60 or 70% of people work remotely, and when we hire people, we really don't mind. I've got someone on my team in Brazil, someone in Germany who's soon going to be in New Zealand. So geography is really not related to our hiring procedure at all. And I think that's also a really interesting development. But sorry, that's maybe a bit of a tangent.
Yeah, relatively new, but in some sectors more so than others. And I think this is a huge shift that we'll see in career opportunities. Christine, I think you were wanting to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, for me, it's a work-life balance. I'm not leaving Indonesia. I have a manufacturing company here. Indonesia is my market. It's the 4th most populated country in the world, 273 million people. And I'll never move back to the United States. I just, once I think you leave your little bubble and you recognize the opportunity that exists in the rest of the world, just in the experience that it gives you and the way it challenges you in all of these incredible ways. I mean, just smells and food and people and knowledge. I'd say that to me is the icing on the cake.
Fantastic. Catherine has a question that she posed in the chat, by the way, and if any of you do have further questions from the audience, please put those in. Thank you, Paul and Phil, for weighing in on that, specifically around the question of language, which is a fairly obvious piece of moving overseas and in terms of language skill. And I think what we're seeing from our panelists is sort of, again, it depends. It's going to depend on the sector that you're in and the country that you move to, but clearly that's an important consideration. While we're on that topic, in terms of future moves and how settled and what value comes from exposing yourself to a new setting, what is the role of language in that? Has it been limiting? What would you encourage people to do?
My advice would just be to go for it. It's probably not as bad as you think it is, and I think probably one of the best ways to learn a language is to really immerse yourself. Having said that, my Swedish is pretty terrible, despite living here for many years, just because Swedes speak such annoyingly perfect English. So it certainly hasn't held me back, but I'm helped by my career and also the country I moved to.
And Paul, what did you want to add on that?
Well, I think I was going to chip in with, definitively, if you're dealing with people's personal lives in any way, so in our case, their children, speaking their language is incredibly important. So I have spent the best part of 10 years learning Spanish before arriving in Spain, and seeing, for example, conversations take place between, say, a teacher of a very young child who's 3 years old and a parent, where they're having to use an interpreter to convey that they really do care about the issue that's being raised. That can create an awful lot of problems, and I can guarantee that although you can get your language so far, that we still occasionally fall back on very terrible British metaphors to try and explain how people's children are developing that absolutely do not translate and can cause huge offence. So I think it depends when you're interacting in particular with people personally, or when you're interacting in particular with the state. Having an excellent knowledge of the language is very useful. So having been a lawyer before becoming a teacher, it's very interesting going through processes in having worked in a precedential system, moving to a codified system of law and seeing the different legalese that is used to try and, I'm sure many of you with the various businesses that you worked for will have encountered the vagaries of different legal systems when you're trying to get something done. But certainly that would really, for me, exclude a number of countries where I couldn't speak the language. So I'd happily move on to work in South America, for example. Freddie could probably tell us more about that, and we'll recommend Argentina. But I would very much struggle to say go and work in Southeast Asia, because I would feel that I couldn't offer the service that I can in Madrid, having spent so long studying Spanish.
Yeah, thank you. I think you point out that even if an organization that you work for accommodates English speaking, or, you know, in Phil's case, right, sort of the science in general, it is a bit of an English speaking field globally, that actually in order to get on, not just in life, but in, you know, gaining the respect of people that you're interacting with, requires that embeddedness in language skills, which might actually over time limit where you're moving. But as you point out, there are many Spanish speaking parts of the world where the culture would be different, but you would have the language skill. Over to you, Freddie. Did you have anything to add on this question of, you know, foreseeing future opportunities and what really the value is to put yourself into a new setting?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I will just say on the language front, obviously it's not so relevant to me now, but the experience I had, interestingly, of working for an international, I guess, English language sort of dominant business in a foreign country was that, funnily enough, to get along at work, you didn't need to speak a word of the local language. It was more outside the office that everything, you know, became so much more important. So it sort of depends, I think, to a degree on what industry you're in. And I'd also sort of add, the thing I've started to see is in the sort of post-Brexit era, as financial services have started to become a little bit more dispersed across the continent of Europe, and we've started to move people out of London into many of our regional offices and kind of reverse the trend of centralizing everything in London, which had been in force for the last 20 years. Plenty of my English British colleagues have started to move to offices in Paris or Milan, and you know, none of them seem to have been even remotely held back by the fact that I don't think they spoke more than, you know, GCSE level of the sort of language they were going into before. As to future plans, I think, you know, sort of coming back to my earlier point, it's hard to know, really, and I think it's also particularly hard to know when you work in an industry which is relatively fast moving in nature. And, you know, if I was to sort of turn the clock back a decade, I don't think one would have predicted that actually lots of the very interesting opportunities in European finance would exist outside of London. Or, you know, you can look at the way that the Hong Kong situation has completely changed the sort of the dynamics of who wants to be based where in Asia, and there's the sort of increase of Singapore as a place to do business, or even the rise of places like Dubai, actually as a sort of alternative hubs in the sort of Eastern Hemisphere for doing business. And I guess as a result of that, you sort of don't know necessarily where the next opportunity is going to come from. And whilst right now it sort of feels pretty clear that the immediate forward for me is going to be in New York, I think I try to keep an open mind about it. I think there's a sort of nostalgic desire to get back to London, insofar as it's where I grew up, and it's still where my family and a lot of my friends are. But at the same time, I don't think necessarily that the grass is always greener in that regard. So I try to be relatively agnostic and just keep an open mind to what the future opportunities might be.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think reminding us of, you know, just in the relatively few previous years to now, there have been so many shifts, and I think we would all be crazy if we could say that we could predict what's going to happen geopolitically, in terms of the markets, in terms of our climate. I mean, we know which direction we're heading on some of these, but we don't really know how it's going to play out. And we're in a world, it's a cliche, but we're in a very volatile world. And so I think being ready to be surprised at what that brings and what opportunities you might take as a result of it is good advice. We do have a question from, I believe it's Ian. What was the biggest non-work mistake you made in your new country, and what did you learn from it? So a non-work mistake, anyone willing to share one? You must have made one, potentially. No non-work mistakes have been made.
I think repeatable non-work mistakes, I think, is the crucial thing here. I've made lots of mistakes I'm not willing to share, but I think I need to think hard about the ones I've made. I think for trying to buy a car, I made quite a glaring error when I didn't realize that actually here, your financial history in the UK, whether you own a house, no matter how much money you have, it doesn't come into whether you can actually finance a car. So decided to take a flat very far away from where I worked on the assumption I would just be able to immediately sign up for a car and drive to work. But now it's a very interesting, very long bus or cab ride because the financial regulations here mean that you can't enter into a hire purchase agreement or even possess a car until you've got certain documentation. So that was one repeatable mistake that I certainly made as a result of not checking how things worked before arriving.
Wow, good to know. Not something I would have known. Anyone else willing to share something that you learned? Phil?
I was
Go on.
just going to say, I think we were talking about language earlier, but there's so many cultural things you can do wrong. Especially, I've spent a lot of time in South America. So, Paul's talking about Spain. It's a similar culture. It's pretty vibrant, but that's still Europe, right? It's not so dissimilar. But coming to Asia, it's very different. And, you can sit the wrong way. You can say the wrong thing, and it's really easy to do. And I think in terms of learning a language, for me, it's the language is important, but because I'm running a company that is, even though I'm a Westerner in Asia, it's an Asian company. And so I really try to take the back seat. And what I do is I let my team lead. I let my team be the face of the company. I let them do the negotiations because these are things that I wouldn't be able to get through on my own anyway. And so I have made many mistakes trying to do business myself when it would have been better. And I know this is supposed to be personal, but I made the same mistakes on a personal level, but when it would have been better to have someone local help me. And I think that's where we forget to leverage resources. You're in a new place. You can't expect to know everything. You should find someone to translate for you. You should find someone to find a place to rent or land or a motorbike or a car for you. Because if you do it on your own, you're likely just to dig yourself a hole.
It's great advice. Some humility as well to know what you don't know. Phil.
I was just going to give a stupid, silly anecdote of a language one. I remember soon after I moved here, I went shopping and I bought something which I thought was milk, but it turned out to be yogurt, feel milk, which is next to the milk and has milk in the title. There's like a million little tiny things like that, but that's part of the fun of it.
Yeah, those things are bound to happen. I just want to come back ever so briefly to Peter's question, because he posits that because you have all these experiences, good, bad, and all learning, you can advance in your career more rapidly through having international experience. Really quick round robin, yes or no? Do you agree? Has that been true of your career, that you felt that you've moved more quickly as a result of your international experience, or that you've just moved differently? So yes, no, maybe so. Start with Paul.
I think definitely in education, moving around.
Great. Christine?
I would say it might depend on what you're doing. If you're working for a corporation and they need to see longevity and commitment to a career path or a certain company, then perhaps not. But for me, it absolutely has, because every job I've ever had has led to me creating my own.
Yeah, great. Freddie?
Yes, absolutely. I think, funnily enough, to just invert what Christine said, working for a big international corporation, showing your willingness to do whatever they want you to do at a given moment in time is generally viewed as a positive in your career trajectory.
Excellent. And Phil?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's pretty standard in science to move around and seen as a good thing. And I think moving abroad is icing on the cake for that.
Okay, and so we don't have any detractors from moving abroad, surprisingly, but yeah, it shapes your career in important ways. So final question for each of you, and we're going to go in the order that we started in, so I will call each of you in turn. What is your one piece of advice, or maybe two, for anyone who's interested in working overseas? I know that we have a diverse group on with us today, but some people may be considering it, they may be still in education, and they may be thinking about, should I, and how do I make that first step? So I believe it's Paul, you're first.
I think speaking to education, first of all, it is actually very important in education to do a few years in your home country, as it were, first, wherever that may be, in order to establish a basis of what you understand is normal in education. And because I think teaching in your first language when you're training is incredibly important. After that, in terms of advice, I would say that picking up a language that you would like to use is absolutely essential if you want to work in Europe. If you want to earn a lot of money, though, Southeast Asia is definitely the place to go in education. So my advice would be, if you want to earn a lot of money, pop over, China in particular, places like that. Whereas if you want to embed yourself in a career and really get to know the local cultural and educational system, somewhere like Europe, you have to know the language.
And probably the long bus rides might help you on that too, Paul.
Lots of listening in on the slightly older people who are catching the bus with me every day.
Yeah, good cultural exposure. Phil, I believe you're next.
Yeah, two small ones there. Firstly, I think it's good to keep a very much open mind about where you want to go. If you get very fixated on going to a specific place, it just makes life a bit more difficult. Whereas if you have vague ideas of rough parts of the world, then you can be open to any opportunities that pop up. And the other thing is, I think it's quite difficult when you're going somewhere new to find out what opportunities are there, because so much of finding a new job is networking. So don't be afraid to go. The way I actually got my job was I got rejected from the post I applied to, and I said, it's all right if I pop into the office just to have a chat anyway. And through that, ended up getting a different job at the same place. So like, go to the country, go to the place, get a feel for it, and talk to people and send people emails and meet up for coffee, and just kind of put yourself out there as much as possible, and opportunities will start to present themselves.
Excellent. That's very bold, but fantastic advice again. Christine. I
would just echo what Phil said, and I think I would just boil that down to just say yes. My experience did not follow a single trajectory, and I would not. If you ask me what my career has been, I have no idea. I mean, I have experience in public health, education, manufacturing now. It's all leading to something. It will all come back, and you'll learn skills in each of those things and in each of those places that you can apply to what you do. The other thing too, I would say, is also what Phil said. If a place, and I think Paul said this too, if a place intrigues you, just go there. I mean, back when I was studying, when I was younger, we didn't do that. I think younger generations, they just go, they just travel, and they go to a place that they want to be in, and they look for opportunity, as opposed to getting online and staying home and being afraid and hoping the opportunity comes to you. So that'd be that.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I think also this comes back to something that was said earlier about the opportunity to work remotely. I'm aware of people who have gone and done remote working with English-based companies, but based in different parts of Europe, where they've also been house sitting, and obviously within the visa regulations or the work abroad regulations. But it's really interesting to see, when I was at that stage of life, we didn't have the internet, but I'm dating myself. So I think just say yes, or just find yourself in a place and recognize that actually where you live and your opportunity for work don't need to be quite as tightly coupled, or at least not in the short run, as they have been for past generations. So over to you, Freddie. What's your one piece of advice to people considering working overseas?
Yeah, I think I'm going to give quite an answer which I think is probably quite specific to people working for in the kind of corporate sector writ large, let's say. I think absolutely you should make yourself be open to these things, and make it clear to the people who have the sort of power to make it happen that you are open to these things. With that said, also be strategic and thoughtful about what you choose to do, because I think there are clearly opportunities to work abroad that exist, which will open up new doors and chapters in your career, and perhaps in unforeseen ways. There are clearly also, in a corporate sense, opportunities to work abroad that probably land you in a dead end. And sometimes, particularly if your goal is to wind up in one of the sort of, let's say, centers for these businesses, be that London or New York or elsewhere, and you move somewhere that's a little bit more peripheral, it can be difficult to get yourself back into the place that you want to be. So I think you do have to be somewhat careful and strategic about it. And I think also when you move abroad, you have to continue to nurture the relationships from the places that you've come from, and maintain that kind of international network, you know, whether it's within your company, whether it's with clients, whatever it might be, because I think you sort of never know when you might need to call on those relationships to engineer a new move in your career, or sort of somewhere back to where you came from or want to end up. And then the other thing I'd say is don't underestimate the degree of difficulty in all of this stuff from a personal sense. And I think that's the first 6 months, let's say, maybe it's shorter, maybe it's longer for different people. I think in a new place, when you're adapting to a new job, even if you're doing more or less the same job as you were in the place that you come from, that same job in a different context, different culture, surrounded by different people, effectively feels like a new job. So that's a pretty exhausting enterprise in and of itself. And then on top of that, weave in all of the complexities of moving your life, whether it's the basic logistics of moving your stuff, setting up all of the things that you need to be able to get on with in your day-to-day life, any of the other sort of personal dimensions, like the degree of difficulty. And my now wife works in finance, so coming to New York, you wouldn't have thought it would be difficult to find another finance job, but once you weave in the complexities of the immigration system, the fact that you're dealing with recruiters who don't recognize UK company names or UK universities in the same way that they recognize US universities, all of those little things. And I think there is a lot of difficulty and a lot of challenge, and I think you have to go in with your eyes wide open to what those difficulties are.
Thank you, Freddie. I'm just noticing we're at the top of the hour, so it's been such a pleasure with all of you. The diversity of your experiences has been really, really enriching, and there's no one size fits all, but it's been really inspiring to spend time with you. Shell's back to just say a closing word.
Brilliant. Again, just to say thank you to our panelists from obviously diverse range of locations and kind of careers and sectors. So a huge thank you to Paul, to Freddie, to Christine, to Phil. I appreciate you're all in different time zones as well. So thank you for joining us at this hour of your day or night. Thank you to Jen for chairing again so brilliantly. And obviously, thank you to everyone for watching. Our events are listed on the website and link all our online community. So hopefully see you online or at an event in person again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.